So another type of government policy that affects markets are taxes. And for taxes, the government levies taxes on many goods and services, using the revenue to pay for schools, for example, national defense, roads, and many other things that the government pays for. So taxes is one of the ways the government generates revenue. And with taxes, the buyer or the seller can be made to pay the tax. So you can think about the tax as a percentage of the goods price or a specific amount for each good sold. And that's the type of tax that we're going to talk about. So for simplicity, we're going to talk about or use per unit taxes. And we're going to show how this affects the supply curve and the demand curve and the market equilibrium. So the way I'm going to do this is with an example. And the example we're going to use is the market for coffee. And so suppose in the market for coffee, we had the following curves. So here are our axes. Here's our supply curve. Here's our demand curve. So here we'll have price, and it's going to be measured in dollars per cup. Here we're going to have quantity, and it's going to be measured in number of cups. All right. Here's our supply curve, and here's our demand curve. And here is our initial equilibrium, and this is the equilibrium without tax. So suppose in this market that the equilibrium without tax is 12 cups of coffee and the price is $5.50 per cup. All right, so that's our equilibrium price and quantity without the tax. And so now we're going to see what happens when there is a tax in this market. And so this is our equilibrium without the tax. So the first type of tax we're going to think about is a tax on buyers. So I'm going to redraw the graph. And suppose the government imposes a $1.50 per unit tax. Okay, so here's our supply and demand curve. And now we're saying that there's a tax. So in order for, so if there's $1.50 per unit tax, and we know that when the price is $5.50, demanders are willing to buy 12 cups of coffee. So in order for the buyers to want 12 cups of coffee after the tax, the price would have to fall by $1.50. So in other words, if I want to, if after the tax, and I'll draw the after tax in purple, I want to buy the same cup of coffee as before the tax, then the price of coffee has to drop by $1.50. So, and so now this price, in order for this buyer to buy 12 cups of coffee, the price would have to fall to $4. And the difference between the two is the tax. And this is true at every quantity. In order to buy the same quantity as before, the price has to drop $1.50 across the board. And so the new demand curve that we get as a result of the tax is a leftward shifted demand curve like this. And the gap between these two pictures is exactly the value of the tax. So let me make some remarks. So P, the price, would have to fall by $1.50 to make buyers willing to buy the same quantity as before. If, after the tax, coffee drops in price from $5.50 to $4, people are still willing to buy 12 units. And so the important rule here is that a tax on buyers shifts the demand curve left by the amount of the tax. And that's what we see in this picture. All right, so now let's think about what happens in the new equilibrium. So I'm going to redraw this on the next page. So here we have our supply curve and our demand curve. And here we have our shifted demand curve that's been shifted by the amount of the tax. Like that. So The new equilibrium will be where the supply curve meets the demand curve, the new demand curve. So the new equilibrium is right here. And what happens here, and this is the interesting thing about it, there's a difference between the price that the buyers pay and the price that the sellers receive. And the difference is exactly the value of the tax. So we know that supply equals the new demand curve at a new quantity, in this case, 10. And we know that buyers, or rather sellers, are going to receive $4.50 for their good. And buyers will pay $6. So the new equilibrium here, so that's where the supply curve and D prime intersect. Occurs when Q equals 10, so that's this quantity, and now we have different prices for the buyers and for the sellers. And the price that the seller receives for the good is $4.50. The price that the buyers pay is $6. And the difference is $1.50, or the value of the tax. So one other point I want to make here, and then the next set we'll talk about what happens when the sellers pay the tax. I want to talk a little bit about the incidence of the tax. The incidence of the tax is how the tax burden is shared between the buyers and sellers. So, in our example, again, I'm going to redraw the shifted supply curve and the new equilibrium. And at this new equilibrium, we have a quantity of 10. Sellers receive $4.50 and buyers pay $6. So, the way we think about the incidence of the tax is comparing how much they pay after the tax or receive after the tax than what they get from before the tax. So compared to the equilibrium, without tax, sellers receive $1 less per unit, and buyers pay 50 cents more per unit. And so even though the tax was placed on the buyers of the good, both the buyers and the sellers are affected, and both share the burden of the tax.